austerity policies adopted to remedy Europe's debt crisis are taking an ever greater toll on jobs and households, with little hope of improvement in sight. That's according to the European Commission. The adverse effects of budget cuts and tax hikes are becoming too apparent to ignore. With Cyprus looking doomed despite an international bailout, many are asking, has Nicosia and other states that have agreed to bailouts effectively signed their death sentences? This is the debate.
Cyprus is the latest victim of the debt crises hitting Europe. Here, people are angry at the austerity measures urged by the European Troika in exchange for a bailout to save this tiny Mediterranean island.
Every 3 months, Troika will be coming back with new measures before they give us the next payment. So that is going to cause even more anger. This wave of people against Troika is going to grow. And we do have some politicians in Cyprus and some political parties which are helping towards that, thinking that they'll get some political benefits from that, but causing damage to the whole economy.
The overall worsening situation in Europe has alarmed the EU, with the European Commission admitting that the Union is facing a social crisis. It has issued a statement warning of the consequences of the crisis. The EU Employment and Social Affairs Commissioner Laszlo Andor said in a statement that the adverse effects of public budget cuts and tax increases on employment and living standards are increasingly apparent. He added the social crisis in Europe keeps worsening, and in a number of member states there is no tangible improvement in sight. The latest figures make for grim reading. In the 27-member European Union, unemployment hit 10.8% in January, leaving more than 26 million jobless, while the 17-nation Eurozone saw a record 11.9% rate of unemployment. Youth unemployment is of particular concern, the report said, running at just under 24% in the EU and led by Spain and Greece with unprecedented rates well above 50%. The dire economic situation in Europe has already caused mass violent protests against government policies across the continent and harsh responses from police. What is certain is that Europe will not be able to get rid of this crisis, the worst since World War II, in the foreseeable future.
You're watching the debate. I'd like to introduce our guest from New York, Mr. Eric Draitser with StopImperialism.com. And with me from London is Simon Dixon, founder of BankToTheFuture.com. I'll put my first question to our guest in New York, Mr. Eric Draitser. Now, the European Commission, Mr. Draitser, has said, I'm quoting here, that the austerity policies adopted to remedy the debt crisis are taking a greater toll on jobs and households. Why?
Well, the effects of the austerity program are creating a very difficult situation for European families. What we see is that the policies that are coming out of Brussels and coming out of the so-called European Parliament, these are the policies that are meant to benefit the financial institutions. They're meant to benefit creditors. They're meant to benefit banks such as Deutsche Bank and others, which had very large exposures in some of these economies, such as Greece, Spain, Italy, Portugal, and others. And so the policies of austerity are in fact meant to benefit these banks to the detriment of everybody else. It's important to note that austerity is at its most basic level the shifting of the burden of the depression from those who created it in the financial establishment to those who must pay for it, being the working class and the poor. That is what austerity is, and its byproducts we can see on the streets of Europe. People angry about lack of jobs, angry about the cuts to social services and so forth. All of that is the byproduct of a flawed policy.
So, Simon Dixon, now in London, the adverse effects of public budget cuts and tax increases we're hearing are the effects that they're having on employment, on living standards. This is something that the European Commission has now basically and publicly acknowledged. So why were these measures adopted in the first place? Did those people who adopt these measures know that this is going to ensue and that they do it with that knowledge?
Well, what we're seeing across all of Europe and all of policy at the moment is a lack of understanding of what the actual cause and root cause of the problems that we suffer today. It's focusing on symptoms. What we have is a nation and the entire Europe which is suffering from a lack of money but too much debt. And so when you're focusing on the symptoms, you could be forgiven for thinking, okay, we've got this huge national debts that we need to pay off and massive interest that we owe to the financial sector. Therefore, we implement some austerity measures. But unfortunately, that has the exact opposite and knock-on effect on the economies in that we still suffer from not enough money and too much debt. The reason that we have that is because we have a deep dependence upon the banking system as essentially the creators of the money supply for all of the European countries. But the problem with bank money is that it's all associated with debt, and the debt just increases.
Right. The argument that those who would go for austerity measures to save the banks, Eric Draitser, is that we can't go without the banking system. What will happen if we just get rid of the banking system? Mr. Draitser, what's your response to that?
My response is that that's the quote of a person who doesn't actually want to deal with the problem, doesn't want to acknowledge the fundamental flaws within not just the banking system, but within the political establishment. The political elite, the policymakers, and the trendsetters in Europe, they are the ones who run in the same circles in the city of London, in Berlin, in Paris, and elsewhere. And so these policies are not crafted by policymakers in any real sense of the word. These are policies that are crafted by executives at Deutsche Bank, Societe Generale, Barclays, RBS, and so forth. And the crisis that we're seeing is a crisis not just of the economic system, but it is a crisis of policy. It is a failed and flawed policy. And I would just say in response to the previous comment that I don't entirely agree that the crisis in Europe is purely a debt crisis or that it was even created necessarily by debt. This is a crisis created primarily by rampant speculation on Wall Street and in London and to a lesser degree in some of the other financial centers of Europe, and over-leveraging and attacking these economies in a variety of ways. Look at the way that the Greek economy was tanked, and you can see international speculators who bet against a currency and tanked an economy. And so we should place the blame, we should point our finger where the blame is deserved, and that is in the financial elite, not some systemic crisis.
Right, yeah, so Mr. Dixon, what's your response to that? Do you think that when you say we're looking at the symptoms now, not the root cause, would you say that the root cause is actually not with the policymakers, politicians, but with what our friend there calls the financial elite?
Well, what I'd say to that is speculation is a symptom that comes from a banking system which is completely flawed. A banking system where we're relying upon the banks for the creation of money. And the challenge is that banks are determining where our money gets spent rather than governments actually determining where money gets spent. And if you leave the banks in charge of where they spend their money, their favorite asset class is always property, which just pushes up property prices beyond control, which is increasing the rich-poor divide. And secondly, as the other speaker said, it's 40% of that goes into financial speculation, which adds no value to society. All it does is bankers charging a commission on trading products with each other, where money's making money and adding no value. You've got to have a redistribution to the productive side of the economy, and the productive side to the economy is small to medium-sized businesses that can create jobs. But being the root cause, I'd say that speculation is a huge problem, but it's still a symptom of a system where we allow the banks to dictate where money goes.
So banking reform, is that the solution that you're speaking about, Mr. Dixon?
Banking reform is exactly where we need to look right now. All we're doing with all our policies right now is kicking the can down the road a little bit further, solving debt with more debt, and then going to institutions like the International Monetary Fund, which are essentially, a larger version of an unsustainable banking system and looking for European central banks to bail us out. We need to actually look at the very roots of the banking system, make some structural changes. Otherwise, we're just going to be kicking the can down the road, and it's going to end in every country looking exactly like the scenes we see in Cyprus today.
Yeah, and since you just referred to Cyprus there, I'll bring the next question to Eric Dreizer on Cyprus. Some people have been describing the bailout deal on Cyprus, Mr. Dreizer, as a death sentence for the country, saying that it's actually not helping at all, and even adversely, it is destroying the country. First of all, do you think that when countries, states like Cyprus, reach this stage, that seeking an international bailout is the only option, though it is the difficult option as well?
Well, no, it's not the only option, but the question regarding Cyprus, I think the most critical question of all is, once again, who pays? Who created the situation and who pays? What the financial elites in Europe, those who came to this initial decision, they wanted to shift the burden of a banking crisis onto the working class and the poor and the middle class as well. And so what you see is that regular Cypriots are meant to pay for the malfeasance and crimes of their banking establishment. Moreover, there is a geopolitical dimension to what's happening in Cyprus. It is a way for the Europeans to, in the interests of the United States, go after Russian investments and Russian finance. The Russians are, of course, predictably angered by these actions by Europe, and there's going to have a knock-on effect. And I think that is one of the reasons why the establishment in Europe has realized now that they way overplayed their hand and that they have to pull back from that. But the fundamental issue in Cyprus and in the rest of Europe, and I agree with the previous speaker, is the issue of the structural integrity of the banking system and the way in which it was created. Though I would caution against using the word reform. I think that what you're really looking at is a reinvention, a necessary reinvention of the banking system so that it once again serves the people rather than the speculators and the moneyed interests.
Well, speaking about Cyprus, the issue that was raised by those who were looking for a rescue for Cyprus, Mr. Dixon, was we shouldn't let Cyprus leave the Eurozone. Now, if that bailout was intended to keep Cyprus in the Eurozone, one analyst was saying that that strategy actually failed because once full capital controls, I'm quoting here, are imposed, a euro in Cyprus will no longer be the same as the euro elsewhere in the euro area. It cannot leave the island, they were saying. It will, in effect, be a new domestic currency. So do you think this capital control issue now in Cyprus means that, as this writer says, the end of the single currency, at least in its present form?
Well, I hope we see the end of the single currency. There's going to be a painful unwinding process in that. But in every disaster, in every situation that we have like today, there's the opportunity for positive change. And Cyprus is faced with the perfect opportunity, as Greece was, and the other countries that are facing disasters, as Iceland does today, to actually have a real reform. I believe in evolution rather than revolution. I think a lot of people get hurt in a revolution. But to have a real reform, rebuild their currency and build it upon sustainable principles and get out of the euro.
Getting out of the euro, Mr. Dreizer, would you say that that's what Greece earlier on should have done and that's what Cyprus should have done instead of accepting this bailout?
I think that hindsight can often be problematic, but in taking the issue as it exists today in the early part of 2013, I don't see an exit out of the euro as a realistic solution. It can be done, certainly, but the social and economic cost of doing that would be devastating, particularly to countries like Greece, which are already teetering on the brink of social collapse. If you talk to people in Greece today, they will tell you the horror stories about about the reality of daily life for most Greek people, a lack of electricity, lack of basic services, rooting through the garbage to find something to eat. This is much of the society in Greece. And when you're talking about some moderate to large amount of pain that country is going to have to go through to move away from the euro, I say that countries like that cannot endure any more punishment. Moreover, I think that moving out of the euro currency opens up these countries to massive speculation against their own currencies. As soon as Greece or Cyprus or anybody else were to exit out of the euro, you would see a massive shorting of their currency, bets placed against the drachma, against the lira, against whatever currency the countries are going to, and that would then immediately tank those currencies. The long-term impact of devaluation and an exit out of the euro, I think, is too much to bear.
Right. Mr. Dixon, I guess they're saying that the option of leaving the Eurozone is not realistic. What's your response to that?
Well, there's total realism in doing that. Yes, there will be consequences. Yes, there will be change. Yes, there'll be speculation. There'll be hedge fund managers that will come in and find opportunities there. But the plethora of opportunity that's not being explored right now is in fact taking away banks' ability to create money and make them a genuine intermediary between borrower and lender, and have the government actually create their own currency and use it for the good of society, rather than banks redistributing their own debt-created currency and using it for financial speculation. And that opportunity is not being explored. There's been reports by the International Monetary Fund into looking at this, and we need to get our economists looking at new ways of doing things rather than kicking the can down the road again.
Right. Speaking again on the situation of the euro, Eric Drates, some have been suggesting that actually a breakup of the eurozone and the removal of the euro as a single currency is going to be inevitable, because they're saying that the principles on which the European Union and the eurozone was built upon is gradually and eventually falling apart. For instance, on the issue of Cyprus, they were saying that they have put in jeopardy now the concept, for instance, of state-guarded deposit insurance there, and the monetary integrity, they were saying, of the eurozone as a whole. And now we have a European Union whose single market principle is under threat by capital controls there. So do you think when we say the eurozone is facing a crisis, that it means we are going to eventually see its breakup anyway?
That's possible. I think that we should be cautious and apprehensive about too much prognostication, but I do believe that the structural integrity of the euro is certainly in question. And I would also point to not just the eurozone and the economic ties between these countries, but the complete lack of any semblance of political integration. The euro currency and the European Union, as it's called, is not in effect a similar to the United States. It is not a federal system. You don't have political integration or even really substantial concrete political ties, nor are there the necessary political mechanisms for addressing some of these fundamental problems. So for that reason, I think the euro is certainly in danger. And I agree with the other guest that that possibly leaving the euro ultimately could be beneficial, and it certainly does go back to the issue of national sovereignty over economies and over the issuance of currency. But again, I stress that the danger in doing that is that you're taking a society in Europe that in many countries is already on the brink of collapse, and you're pushing it over the edge, and that could create conditions and lasting impacts that we might not even be able to foresee. And I have very real reservations about advocating such a policy given the economic, political, and cultural circumstances.
Right. So, Mr. Dixon, do you think that it's too soon to say whether there will be a eurozone breakup now?
Well, it's a game of politics. You know, what's going to happen is inevitable. There's going to be reform. I believe that there's going to be a breakup. There's going to be, you know, a return to where we were before. The question of timing is a question of politics, and politics is impossible to forecast because it's in the hands of big Germany or the European Union.
So there is some kind of contradiction when we are speaking about this Eurozone breakup, possible breakup or not. We see a lot of insistence, for instance, from the side of Germany or these international lenders that we want to prevent this from happening. We want to prevent a country from leaving the Eurozone. That's why we're putting all this effort, giving all this money and going ahead with this bailout. At the same time, with what's happened, for instance, in Cyprus, a lot of people are saying that what they are doing for Cyprus is effectively forcing Cyprus eventually to have to leave the Eurozone. So there's a bit of a contradiction there, isn't it?
Well, you have to remember that nobody's giving money.
Yes.
People are finding new markets for their debt.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no one's giving money. People are finding new markets for their debt. All of this bailout money is associated with repayments plus interest. So it's just a way of perpetuating a debt monetary system further and further and further. And you can't solve debt with more debt. There's got to be an end to that.
Right, so now, Eric Draitser, a lot of people have been speaking about what the European Commission called the social crisis. And looking at the situation right now in Cyprus, thousands of people who've come out in the streets. We've seen similar protests take place in Greece, elsewhere. Do you think the fact that people have come out, there's been popular protests, this is putting pressure on what you call the financial elite, and this is going to change things?
Well, to some degree that may be true, although I'm not sure that the financial elites had any interest in responding to the millions of Europeans in Spain, Italy, Portugal, and elsewhere that turned out into the streets. I think much more realistic is the financial elites of Europe responding to pressure from Moscow and from other interested players in this situation who are saying that they refuse to accept the terms of this bailout, knowing that they are essentially being the ones that are forced to fund a bailout that is at the very least initiated by Germany and the most powerful financial interests in Europe. Remember that it was the German banks that were primarily, or perhaps most specifically, responsible for what for the crisis that was precipitated in Greece. Deutsche Bank was one of a number of banks that were heavily leveraged in Greece, and so what we're seeing is that Germany in particular in an election year has pushed very hard for the most harsh possible terms on a bailout agreement with Cyprus, and by doing so they have created this divide between north and south in Europe, where the northern industrial economies are essentially trying to portray the southerners as lazy and backwards economically speaking. And remember also that Germany is terrified of a dissolution of the euro because it would make their export-driven economy almost impossible to sustain. So it is in their own self-interest that countries like Germany and France are pushing this agenda.
Right, we're quickly running out of time. I'd like to give the last comments to Mr. Dixon now in London. If you can, under a minute, tell us, Mr. Dixon, do you think that we should be expecting what some have called political upheavals, not just in Cyprus, but in other countries in the Eurozone as well?
Well, if we continue to kick the can down the road, then it's the inevitable consequence. We've seen the first signs, really, in countries like the UK, when we see the credit ratings get downgraded. That's the first signs of an appetite no longer to lend to a government. When that happens, they can no longer bail out banks, and the next time we have a banking crisis, which is inevitable under the existing system, and the government steps in, when they're already having a policy of austerity measures, it causes big problems with the public. And you know, the next ones, it will all be resulting in the same public upheaval, which is something that we all need to prevent.
Mr. Simon Dixon, founder of banktothefuture.com, with us there live from London. Thank you very much. A big thank you to our guest in New York, Mr. Eric Draitser, with stopimperialism.com. That's all the time we have for this edition of The Debate. From me, Homa Lesgi. Until our next programme, it's goodbye.